Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So this series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, March 14th, 1783, March 15th, actually 1783, George Washington delivers an address at Newburgh, New York, to stave off a revolt that he potentially had on his hands. 1783, of course, the year that the war ended. The British were ultimately defeated later that summer. So it's maybe a bit surprising that there were rumors of a coup within the Continental troops that would depose George Washington just as victory was in their grasp. So here to discuss the Newburgh Conspiracy. Folks, we will do anything with the word conspiracy in its name. So here to discuss the Newburgh Conspiracy are, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
So I want to start, we'll get into what the Newburgh Conspiracy was, but I want to start with this moment itself and this address that Washington gives that seemingly totally undermines this brewing coup attempt. And, you know, if you read some of the history, both written by Washington himself, but also, you know, written over time, it's presented as this moment where kind of through the sheer power of his words, Washington was able to single-handedly convince his troops not to revolt. There's not a dry eye in the room. There's birds that come rest on his shoulder. The clouds start parting. Unicorns are frolicking in the background. No, but seriously, you know, it is sort of fascinating to see how this gets presented. So I guess my question to you, Kellie, you know, as we start to describe this moment is kind of, do you buy that just he was so powerful that he undermined a possible coup?
Yes and no.
Okay.
I say yes in that we all love a good speech, right? We all love, you know, a motivation, someone who will take the reins, who will make us feel better about ourselves, or challenge us. And I think Washington is doing that. He's speaking before his men passionately. He's discussing his loyalty to the country. He's encouraging them to sort of step up and have the same sort of loyalty that he has. And he has this line where he says, "Gentlemen, you must pardon me." And then he says, "For I have not only grown gray, but almost blind in service to my country." And I mean, at that point, it's sort of like, oh man, we were planning a coup. You know, it's like you almost want to rethink everything when you realize that he has put so much on the line in service for this country. It really rallies the troops.
Yeah, I'm also in the Kellie camp of, you know, George Washington was this towering figure during the war. He's the one that led the American troops through this war year after year, who called on them to be more than just summer soldiers and to fight with him through thick and thin. And so he does have this outsized presence in this very young United States folklore. But he also, you kind of get the sense that he knew what he was doing when he's like, trembling hands, pulling out his glasses, talking about how he's gone gray in service to his country. It even started to lose his eyesight. Like, I'm not sure how artless and spontaneous that particular moment was.
Sure.
I think he was cultivating an environment that made it possible for these men to say, all right, we can wait a little longer.
Yeah. Which, of course, is connected to kind of how we got to this moment and what this conspiracy was about. But yeah, I think it is reasonable to think that he knew in what's still a relatively small circle of the troops that he's leading, that there were grumblings and possible coup attempts. And so the notion of him walking into a meeting where they were ostensibly considering what action to take around these grumblings and then changing a handful of people's opinion through the power of oratory is not that unreasonable. I'm just struck by some of the language around it, especially some of the language he uses. He writes letters kind of about this moment where he basically says, like, I was obliged to take the reins and pull us back from the gulf of civil horror from which there might be no receding. So it's just this nice reminder that people write their own story and they also take considerably admirable action. But to the conspiracy itself, Niki, what is your sense of what the grumblings were and why the Continental Army troops were really on the verge of a coup?
Yeah, I mean, the grumblings were very practical and may actually help explain why the speech seems to have worked. They wanted to get paid. They were promised money for their service, and now all of a sudden the Continental Congress is twiddling its thumbs and kind of being like, well, we don't really have the money. We can't really pay you right now. I mean, we're super grateful that you gave your lives and your fortune and your sacred honor for this country. We don't want to tax people, so I don't know. And so basically they're just saying, we have all of the guns, so maybe you should pay us. And so because it wasn't like they were hoping to seize power, right? They weren't looking to run the government. They just wanted their money.
Yeah, I think so much of morale is tied up in provision. Can you provide soldiers with food, with shelter, with, adequate equipment, with money that they can send home to their families as they've been gone for months on end, sometimes longer. And it has a crucial impact on how people believe, they will be treated if there is victory. What happens if there's no victory? Then what happens?
Yeah, well, that's a really good point. It's almost like, this is your first opportunity to show that you know how to run a functioning country, right? If you're asking us to start a new country, well, one of the things is be competent in these regards. But, I would say if we're making the list of lessons learned over the course of this show, it's, pay your troops well because they will get grumpy. The other sort of obscure coup attempt that we discussed much later, the business plot was started as grumbling around pay. I think that's a big part of it, and that's what a lot of the sort of petitions that were being circulated were around. I am curious, though, how legit, and this is another theme whenever we talk about possible coup attempts, how legit was this actually? Was this the equivalent of internal HR squabble bluff, or was there really an actual coup attempt brewing, or somewhere in between?
I'm going to go with somewhere in between. And the reason that I say that is it is a coup that can be solved with money, which is often not the case again. But it was being used to influence what Congress was doing, right? It wasn't just that the army wanted to get paid. There were real issues about how this new government was going to be funded. And that was one of the fights that was taking place in Congress at that time. And so people like Alexander Hamilton were like, this could be a great opportunity, not just to get those troops their money, but to have taxing and tariff powers in this new constitution and have like a robust, well-funded federal government. And so the fact that the discontent of the troops was going to be used for these political battles does tilt it a little more into coup-ish territory.
Yeah. I also think that, people wanted Washington to not just be their leader. They wanted him to be a king. They wanted him to sort of step up and take the place of monarchy that they were familiar with, so that they could sort of make these executive decisions without having to go through the channels of democracy in a republic. So in some ways, they're just trying to find anyone who will meet their needs as efficiently and as quickly as possible. And if Washington can do that, then great. If not, then let's think about other ways to get the job done.
That's really interesting. And I get the sense in reading about this that this is the culmination, or at least, later stages of years of basically prodding Washington to be a little more forceful. And then finally here, maybe, it sort of gets him off his ass or whatever. And not that he was being lazy, but, it gets him to really say, I got to be the leader here. I do want to say, though, that I think this is a big historian debate about whether this was a sort of a coup attempt that was sort of destined to be a bluff or even destined to fail just to shake things up, or was actually plotted out. Some of the petitions that were being circulated at the time were pretty practical. There were plans for, if the British won, soldiers would then abandon the colonies and move out west. And then if the Americans decisively won, it encouraged them to turn their guns on the liberated colonies and overthrow the Continental Congress. So there was some meat on the bones here in terms of the gaming it out.
Yeah, and the Congress actually flees Philadelphia because they're concerned about troops coming for them. So it's not that there wasn't danger. And there were a lot of the rebellions of the 1780s are around things like, what do you do with these disgruntled, dissatisfied troops, which is going to play a big role in the decision to have a civilian-controlled military going forward. But this was a real threat, in large part because everything was so fragile, right? There was nothing certain or set in stone. There were a lot of mistakes still to be made in setting up this new government and bringing everyone on board with it. And so we can look back now and say, it was fine. They paid the troops their money. It all got settled. But in the moment, the contingencies were pretty big.
So as we start to wrap up, how does this end? So Washington gives the Newburgh Address. Again, there's not a dry eye in the House, but it also is backed up by actual practical measures too, right?
So I think, part of the people that were opposed to Washington start to sort of backpedal a little bit and realize that maybe he has a little bit more control over the situation than they thought. And then the good thing is that a lot of the soldiers who were, petitioning for pay actually get that pay, and they get compensated, and it helps them to, turn the tide of the war and actually win the war.
And it actually, it tamps down some of this discontent because it gives them, in some ways, more money up front. They had been guaranteed a half pension for life. Instead, they get a full pension right up front. And it also does move the needle on the idea of taxation, that Congress does have a power to raise money. And that was a really important shift.
Yeah. And as we said, just a few months later, you have Yorktown, and things turn pretty quick. And so, it is this interesting kind of what if. I guess most wars are full of what ifs every few weeks. But yes, this is this very interesting moment that shores things up, so to speak. All right. Well, let's leave it there. Before we go, I do want to do one thing, which is give a shout out to a listener named Kevin Bertram, who listened to our episode about the Barbary Wars, if you remember those, where we sent troops over to the shores of Tripoli and took on some pirates. And Kevin Bertram is an independent game designer and has designed a board game, which I'm holding up now, and Niki and Kellie are looking at it. And it's called The Shores of Tripoli. He got in touch. He sent it my way. I have played it once. It is very fun. One side is the pirates, one side is the American troops with a couple little Swedish reinforcements. The Swedes are in there as well, as we discussed. But shout out to Kevin Bertram for making this game and sending it our way. And his company is Fort Circle Games. And if you want a very nerdy historical board game, this is the one for you.
This is the audience for that, I think.
I know, right? This is perfect.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. What we're going to do is we're going to get a dozen emails from people be like, I'm an independent historical game designer too. I can't believe it.
Bring it on.
We know our audience. Okay. That brings us to the end of the show. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Kala Nakua helps with our transcripts, which you can find at our website, thisdaypod.com. Also on our website is a way to get in touch with us. There are bios for all of us, much more about the show, and a way to support the show directly if you would like. You can become a monthly member, or you can give a one-time donation. Thank you so much for doing that. Follow us on social media. We're at thisdaypod on Instagram and Twitter. My name is Jody Avergan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Radiotopia.